The radio crackled through static at 3:47 hours, breaking the pre-dawn silence over Bagram airfield like a blade through silk. Mayday, Mayday, this is Viper 6-1. We are Winchester on ammo and taking heavy fire from all directions. Request immediate close air support, over. The voice belonged to Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reaper Valdez, leader of SEAL Team 6's Alpha Squad, and even through the digital compression, you could hear something that SEALs never let slip into their voices: desperation. Captain Kestrel Wraith Thorne was already suiting up when the alert klaxons began wailing across the flight line. At 29, she'd logged more combat hours in the A-10 Thunderbolt II than most pilots twice her age, but that didn't stop the sideways glances from the ground crews as she strode toward her aircraft. The Warthog sat hunched on the tarmac like a sleeping predator, its titanium bathtub cockpit gleaming under the harsh floodlights. Someone had spray-painted "Ladies First" across the nose art overnight again. Kestrel didn't even break stride. The situation briefing came through her helmet as she ran through pre-flight checks with mechanical precision. Viper 6-1 had been inserted 12 clicks southeast of Kandahar to capture a high-value target, a bomb maker known as the Chemist, who'd been ghost dancing through intelligence networks for 18 months. Simple grab-and-go operation. Except the intelligence was wrong. Dead wrong. Instead of finding a lone bomb maker in a mud-brick compound, the 12 SEALs had walked into a hornet's nest of 40-plus Taliban fighters dug into hardened positions with RPGs, heavy machine guns, and what sounded like at least one DSHK anti-aircraft gun. Control, this is Boneyard 27, requesting immediate takeoff clearance. Kestrel's voice cut through the radio chatter with the kind of calm that only comes from someone who'd already made peace with whatever was waiting in the dark. The tower cleared her hot, and the twin General Electric turbofans spooled up with a sound like controlled thunder. As the A-10 lifted off into the pre-dawn gloom, Kestrel couldn't shake the feeling that something about this mission was different. Maybe it was the way Reaper's voice had cracked just slightly when he'd said all directions. Or maybe it was the fact that in 4 years of close air support missions, she'd never heard a SEAL team call for help twice in the same transmission. What she didn't know yet was that Viper 6-1 wasn't just trapped. They were being systematically hunted by an enemy that had turned a routine raid into a perfectly orchestrated ambush. And in exactly 17 minutes, Kestrel Thorne would have to make a choice that would either save 12 of America's finest warriors or add her own name to the growing list of aircraft shot down over Afghanistan's unforgiving terrain. The A-10 banked southeast toward Kandahar, its distinctive silhouette cutting through the last of the night sky like a mechanical angel of death. Below, 12 men waited in the darkness, counting ammunition and praying to whatever gods watch over warriors that their angel would arrive in time. The clock on Kestrel's instrument panel read 3:52 hours. Sunrise was still 3 hours away, but for SEAL Team 6, dawn might never come at all. Static filled her headphones as she pushed the throttles forward, racing toward a battle that would test every skill she'd learned in 4 years of combat flying. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same pilots who questioned whether she belonged in a cockpit would soon be studying footage of what she was about to do, trying to understand how one A-10 pilot had managed to pull off the impossible. But first, she had to reach them alive. Viper 6-1, this is Boneyard 27, inbound your position. Say your status, over. Kestrel's voice cut through the static with professional calm, though her knuckles were already white against the stick. The response that came back made her blood run cold. Boneyard 27, we've got 11 KIA. The transmission cut to static. Then Reaper's voice returned, strained and barely audible over automatic weapons fire. Correction, we've got 11 men down, 2 KIA confirmed. We're down to our last magazine each and they're closing in from the north and east. We've got maybe 10 minutes before they overrun our position. Kestrel's jaw tightened. 11 men down meant only one SEAL was still in the fight alongside Reaper. 2 against 40 with limited ammunition and no cover. In military parlance, that wasn't a tactical situation. It was a massacre waiting to happen. Roger that, Viper 6-1. Be advised, I'm 2 mics out from your position. Can you mark your location with IR strobes? Negative on the strobes, Boneyard. Lost our beacon in the initial contact. We're in a mud brick compound approximately 200 meters north of the target building. Single story, collapsed wall on the eastern side. How copy? Kestrel's eyes swept across her instrument panel, calculating vectors and fuel consumption, while her right hand instinctively found the weapon selector switch. The GAU-8, a Avenger rotary cannon, carried 1,174 rounds of 30-depleted uranium ammunition, enough to turn concrete into dust and steel into vapor. But in a close-quarters situation with friendlies in the target area, the massive cannon was as likely to kill SEALs as Taliban. Good copy, Viper 6-1. I'm going to need you to mark hostile positions with tracer fire on my approach. How much ammo you got left for marking? A pause, then Reaper's voice, tight with pain. Maybe 30 rounds between us. Petty Officer Kowalski's been hit in the shoulder, but he's still in the fight. Kestrel closed her eyes for exactly 1 second, running through every close air support scenario she trained for at Nellie's Air Force Base. None of them had prepared her for this. A 2-man element surrounded by overwhelming enemy forces in an urban environment with limited ammunition for target marking. This was the kind of mission that ended with flag-draped coffins and carefully worded letters to families. But as the lights of Kandahar appeared on the horizon, Kestrel Thorne made a decision that would define not just her career, but her legacy. She was going in anyway. The A-10 dropped to 500 feet above ground level, its titanium belly glinting in the starlight as she began her approach to the target area. Through her night vision goggles, she could see muzzle flashes erupting from positions all around the compound like deadly fireflies in the darkness. Somewhere in that chaos, 2 American warriors were making their last stand, and Captain Kestrel Thorne was about to show the world why they called her Wraith. Viper 6-1, this is Boneyard 2-7 beginning my approach from the south. When I call mark, light up the closest threats with everything you've got. We're going to get you out of there. Down in the compound, Reaper pressed his back against a crumbling wall and checked his remaining ammunition 1 more time. 7 rounds in his M4, plus 1 fragmentation grenade. Kowalski was worse than he'd let on. The shoulder wound was bleeding heavily, and his left arm hung useless at his side. The Taliban fighters were close enough now that he could hear them calling to each other in Pashto, coordinating their final assault. Above the sound of approaching footsteps and clicking AK-47s, Reaper heard something else, the distinctive whine of twin turbofan engines approaching fast and low. He'd worked with A-10 pilots before, knew the sound of a warthog better than his own heartbeat. But he'd never heard one flown quite like this, aggressive, almost angry, like the aircraft itself was looking for a fight. Kowalski, he whispered to his wounded teammate, when that A-10 makes its run, we mark targets on the north wall. Soon as the shooting stops, we move for the breach in the eastern wall. Copy. Petty Officer First Class Danny Kowalski nodded, his face pale but determined. At 24, he was the youngest member of Alpha Squad, but right now he was also half of the only thing standing between the Taliban and a propaganda victory that would echo across every news network in the world. The sound of the A-10's engines grew louder, and Reaper allowed himself 1 moment of hope. Maybe, just maybe, they were going to make it home after all. What he didn't know was that Captain Kestrel Thorne was about to attempt something that had never been tried in combat before, a precision gun run at night, in an urban environment, with friendlies less than 50 meters from the target area. In the cockpit of Boneyard 2-7, Kestrel's hands moved across the controls with practiced efficiency, arming systems, and calculating angles of attack. The compound appeared in her targeting display, a cluster of rectangular shapes surrounded by muzzle flashes. She could see the breach in the eastern wall that Reaper had mentioned, but more importantly, she could see the tactical situation developing below. The Taliban weren't just attacking, they were executing a textbook pincer movement, with fighters advancing from multiple directions while support elements provided covering fire from elevated positions. It was sophisticated, coordinated, and deadly effective. Whoever was commanding this operation knew exactly what they were doing. Mark, mark, mark. Kestrel's voice cut through the radio static. 50 feet below, tracer rounds erupted from the compound as Reaper and Kowalski identified the most immediate threats. Red streams of light reached out toward muzzle flashes on the north wall, and Kestrel's targeting computer locked onto the illuminated positions with mechanical precision. The GAU-8, a Avenger cannon, spoke once, a 2-second burst that sounded like the world's largest chainsaw cutting through steel. 30 rounds of depleted uranium ammunition struck the north wall of the compound at 3,500 feet per second, turning mud brick into powder and Taliban fighters into memory. But even as the dust settled from her first gun run, Kestrel could see more muzzle flashes erupting from positions she hadn't hit. The enemy had backup positions, redundant fields of fire, overlapping kill zones. This wasn't just an ambush. It was a trap that had been months in the planning. Viper 6-1, how copy on that run? Kestrel's voice remained steady despite the growing realization of what she was up against. Outstanding, Boneyard. You got at least 6 of them, but we've still got contact to the east and west. They're moving to flank us through the breach. Kestrel banked the A-10 hard left, bringing her around for another approach. Through her night vision, she could see the tactical picture changing by the second. The Taliban were adapting to her presence, shifting positions, using the cover of buildings to mask their movement. They'd obviously trained for this scenario, how to counter close air support, how to use urban terrain to limit an aircraft's effectiveness. What they hadn't trained for was fighting an A-10 pilot who'd grown up reading accounts of Hans Ulrich Rudel and studying gun camera footage from every close air support mission flown since Vietnam. Kestrel Thorne didn't just fly the Warthog. She thought like it, predatory and relentless. Viper 6-1, I'm coming around from the west. When I call danger close, you and Kowalski get as low as possible. This one's going to be tight. In the compound, Reaper felt his stomach drop. Danger close meant the ordnance would be landing within 600 meters of friendly forces. Given their tactical situation, Kestrel was probably planning to drop it much closer than that. How close we talking, Boneyard? Kestrel's voice came back flat and professional, close enough that you're going to feel the concussion. Trust me. Above the compound, the A-10 lined up for its second attack run, and Captain Kestrel Thorne prepared to thread a needle that would either save 2 American lives or add her own name to the casualty reports. The margin for error was measured in feet, and there would be no second chances. The Taliban fighters advancing on the compound had no idea they were about to meet a pilot who'd spent 4 years turning precision close air support into an art form. They were about to learn why Air Force ground crews had started calling her Wraith, because by the time you heard her coming, you were already dead. Danger close, danger close. Kestrel's warning crackled through the radio as the A-10 dove toward the compound at a 60-degree angle, its cannon already spinning up to firing speed. What happened next would be studied at every military academy in the world, dissected by tacticians and flight instructors trying to understand how one pilot had managed to change the entire course of a battle with a single gun run. But in that moment, all Kestrel could focus on was the targeting reticle centered on a cluster of muzzle flashes barely 30 meters from where 2 American warriors waited for salvation or death. The night sky erupted in thunder and fire as the Warthog's cannon spoke again, this time for 4 seconds straight. 140 rounds of depleted uranium struck the compound's western wall with surgical precision, walking a line of destruction so close to Reaper and Kowalski's position that concrete fragments rained down on their heads like deadly hail. When the dust cleared, the western approach to the compound had ceased to exist, along with every Taliban fighter who'd been using it for cover. But the battle was far from over. Through her night vision, Kestrel could see more movement in the surrounding buildings. The enemy had positioned fighters throughout the neighborhood, turning every rooftop and alleyway into a potential firing position. This wasn't just a raid gone wrong. It was a carefully orchestrated trap designed to draw in and destroy American rescue forces one aircraft at a time. Viper 6-1, I count at least 20 more hostiles in the surrounding buildings. What's your status on movement to the LZ? Reaper's voice came back strained. Negative on movement, Boneyard. Kowalski's lost a lot of blood, and we've got eyes on our position from multiple buildings. Soon as we leave this compound, they'll cut us down before we make it 50 meters. Kestrel felt her jaw tighten as the tactical situation crystallized in her mind. The SEALs were pinned in the compound by crossfire from surrounding buildings, but those same buildings provided too much cover for her to effectively engage with the cannon. She needed a different approach, something that would eliminate multiple targets simultaneously while creating enough chaos to allow the SEALs to move. Her eyes fell on the weapons panel, specifically the stations carrying two AGM-65 Maverick missiles. Air-to-surface missiles in an urban environment was risky. The blast radius could easily catch friendly forces, and the collateral damage would be significant. But looking at the tactical display, Kestrel realized she might not have a choice. Viper 6-1, I'm going to need you to identify the two buildings with the heaviest concentration of enemy fighters. Can you do that without exposing your position? A pause, then Reaper's voice. Roger, we've got heavy machine gun fire coming from a 3-story building to the north, maybe 150 meters from our position. And there's coordinated small arms fire from a 2-story compound to the southeast. Those seem to be their primary fire positions. Kestrel's targeting computer locked onto both buildings, calculating firing solutions and blast patterns. The mathematics were unforgiving. Even with precision-guided munitions, she'd be walking the edge of a knife. Too close, and she'd kill the very people she was trying to save. Too far, and the SEALs would remain pinned down until they ran out of ammunition entirely. Copy that, Viper 6-1. I'm going to put 2 Mavericks into those buildings simultaneously. When they detonate, you'll have maybe 30 seconds before the enemy regroups. That's your window to move for the eastern breach and head for the LZ. How copy? Good copy, Boneyard. We'll be ready. But even as she spoke, Kestrel could hear the doubt in Reaper's voice. Kowalski was badly wounded, and carrying him 200 meters to the landing zone under fire would be nearly impossible, even with the distraction of the missile strikes. She needed to give them more than 30 seconds. She needed to give them a corridor of fire that would keep enemy heads down long enough for them to reach extraction. Banking the A-10 into a wide circle around the compound, Kestrel began formulating a plan that would either be remembered as one of the most audacious close air support missions in military history, or as the final flight of Captain Kestrel Thorne. The fuel gauge showed she had maybe 20 minutes of loiter time left, and the eastern horizon was already beginning to show the first hints of dawn. In 20 minutes, this battle would be over one way or another. The only question was whether Viper 6-1 would be going home, or whether their families would be receiving folded flags and carefully worded condolences. Viper 6-1, missiles away. Kestrel's voice was steady as her thumb depressed the firing button twice in quick succession. 2 AGM-65 Mavericks streaked away from the A-10's wing pylons, their infrared seekers locked onto the heat signatures of the enemy positions. The night sky lit up like daylight as both missiles found their targets within seconds of each other. The 3-story building to the north disappeared in a cloud of dust and flame, while the southeastern compound collapsed in on itself with a rumbling crash that could be heard for kilometers. In the space of 10 seconds, Kestrel had eliminated nearly half of the enemy force. But she wasn't finished. As debris still fell from the missile strikes, the A-10 dove toward the compound again, this time approaching from the east. Kestrel had spotted something in her previous passes, a cluster of vehicles parked behind the target building that had been obscured by smoke and dust. Now, with the night vision system cutting through the haze, she could see them clearly. 3 technical vehicles mounting heavy machine guns, positioned to block any escape route toward the landing zone. The GAU-8 cannon spoke again, this time in a sustained 5-second burst that turned the vehicle park into a junkyard of twisted metal and burning fuel. Secondary explosions rippled through the area as ammunition cooked off, sending tracer rounds screaming in random directions like deadly fireworks. "Move, move, move." Kestrel's voice cut through the radio static as she pulled the A-10 into a climbing turn. "You've got clear passage to the east." Down in the compound, Reaper didn't need to be told twice. He hauled Kowalski to his feet, supporting the wounded SEAL's weight as they stumbled through the breach in the eastern wall. Behind them, the compound that had been their fortress for the past hour was now a smoking ruin, but ahead lay 200 meters of open ground that might as well have been a minefield. They'd covered maybe 50 meters when the first AK-47 rounds began snapping past their heads. The surviving Taliban fighters were regrouping faster than expected, moving through the rubble to establish new firing positions. Reaper could see muzzle flashes erupting from windows and doorways all around them, and he knew that without air support, they'd never make it to the landing zone. Above them, Kestrel saw the developing situation and made a decision that would define her legacy. Instead of making high-speed attack runs and then climbing back to safe altitude, she brought the A-10 down to less than 200 feet and began flying a continuous orbit around the SEALs, using the aircraft's cannon to suppress any enemy position that threatened them. It was called gun trucking, an extremely dangerous tactic where the close air support aircraft maintained constant presence over friendly forces, essentially becoming a flying tank. The problem was that at low altitude and slow speed, the A-10 became vulnerable to small arms fire and portable surface-to-air missiles. One lucky shot with an RPG could end the mission permanently. But as she watched Reaper half-carrying Kowalski across the open ground, dodging from cover to cover while enemy rounds kicked up dust around their feet, Kestrel knew she didn't have a choice. These were American warriors, and she wasn't going to let them die on her watch. Viper 6-1, I've got continuous overwatch. Just keep moving toward the LZ. The next 5 minutes would test every skill Kestrel had learned in 4 years of combat flying, as she danced the A-10 through a maze of small arms fire and RPG rounds while simultaneously engaging targets that were sometimes less than 20 meters from friendly forces. The cannon fired in precise 2-second bursts, each one carefully aimed to suppress enemy positions without endangering the SEALs below. By the time Reaper and Kowalski stumbled into the landing zone, a small clearing about the size of a basketball court, both men were exhausted and nearly out of ammunition. But they were alive, and more importantly, they could hear the distant sound of helicopter rotors approaching from the south. "Boneyard 27, this is Dustoff 68, a new voice crackled over the radio. "We've got your wounded Americans on scope. Can you provide cover for our approach?" Kestrel smiled grimly as she brought the A-10 around for another protective orbit. "Roger, Dustoff. I've got plenty of ammo left and nowhere else to be. Come on in." But even as the medevac helicopter flared for landing, Kestrel could see movement in the surrounding buildings. The Taliban weren't finished yet. They were massing for one final assault, trying to overwhelm the landing zone before the helicopter could extract the wounded SEALs. What followed would become known in military circles as the Kandahar Corridor. 5 minutes of the most intensive close air support ever provided by a single aircraft, as Captain Kestrel Thorne used every remaining round of ammunition to hold off a final enemy assault, while American wounded were loaded onto a rescue helicopter. The A-10's cannon fired continuously, walking streams of depleted uranium through enemy positions with surgical precision. When the 30 ammunition was exhausted, Kestrel switched to her remaining rockets, then to her emergency flares, using everything at her disposal to keep enemy heads down until the helicopter could clear the area. By the time Dustoff 68 lifted off with its precious cargo, the surrounding neighborhood looked like the surface of the moon, cratered and smoking, with debris scattered across hundreds of meters. The Taliban assault had been broken, their fighters either dead or scattered to the wind. But as Kestrel turned Bone Yard 27 toward home, she realized that something had changed during those 30 minutes of combat. The radio chatter from other aircraft in the area had shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe. Word was spreading through the tactical net about what she'd accomplished, how one A-10 pilot had single-handedly turned a potential disaster into a successful rescue operation. More than that, she could hear it in the voices of the ground crews when she checked in with Bagram Tower. The same men who'd been spray-painting jokes on her aircraft were now asking for gun camera footage, wanting to see exactly how she'd managed to pull off the impossible. For the first time in 4 years, Captain Kestrel Thorne wasn't fighting for respect. She'd earned it with 30 depleted uranium and precision flying that bordered on art. But as she began her approach to Bagram, she couldn't shake the feeling that this mission was just the beginning of something larger. The Taliban had shown a level of tactical sophistication that suggested foreign training and support. The ambush had been too well coordinated, too professionally executed to be the work of local fighters alone. Someone had been planning this operation for months, and they'd been specifically targeting American Special Operations Forces. As the A-10 touched down on Bagram's runway with the first light of dawn breaking over the Hindu Kush Mountains, Kestrel had no idea that her performance over Kandahar had been recorded by multiple surveillance systems, or that footage of her gun runs was already being analyzed by intelligence officers trying to understand how one pilot had managed to neutralize such an overwhelming enemy force. She also didn't know that Lieutenant Commander Marcus Reaper Valdez had already submitted a recommendation for the Distinguished Flying Cross, or that Petty Officer Kowalski, despite his wounds, had spent the helicopter ride to the field hospital telling anyone who would listen about the A-10 pilot who'd saved their lives. What she did know was that somewhere over Kandahar, something had changed. The jokes and sideways glances were fading, replaced by nods of acknowledgement and requests for tactical advice. Captain Kestrel Wraith Thorne had finally proven what she'd always known, that skill and courage had nothing to do with gender, and everything to do with the willingness to put your life on the line for your fellow warriors. But as she climbed out of the cockpit and walked across the flight line toward the debriefing room, Kestrel couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the first act of a much larger drama. The enemy had shown their hand in Kandahar, revealing capabilities and intentions that would have far-reaching implications for American operations throughout Afghanistan. The war was about to change, and Captain Kestrel Thorne was about to find herself at the center of it all. 3 days after the Kandahar rescue, Kestrel found herself in a briefing room she'd never seen before, surrounded by colonels and intelligence officers whose name tags were either classified or simply absent. The man at the head of the table introduced himself only as Control, and his first words made it clear that her successful mission had attracted attention from levels of command she'd never imagined. "Captain Thorne," Control began, his voice carrying the kind of authority that comes from decisions made in windowless rooms, "your performance over Kandahar has raised some interesting questions about enemy capabilities in theater. We've analyzed the gun camera footage from your mission, and we've identified several concerning patterns in enemy tactics and equipment. The screen behind him lit up with aerial reconnaissance photos of the compound where Viper 6-1 had been trapped. Even from altitude, the sophistication of the Taliban positions was obvious. Interlocking fields of fire, prepared fallback positions, communication trenches that hadn't existed in previous surveillance images. This level of tactical sophistication suggests foreign advisors, Control continued. Russian, Iranian, possibly Chinese. Someone has been training Taliban forces in advanced small unit tactics and urban warfare. More importantly, someone provided them with intelligence about SEAL Team 6's operational patterns. Kestrel felt her blood run cold. Sir, are you saying this was an inside job? We're saying that Viper 6-1 walked into a trap that was specifically designed to capture or kill American Special Operations personnel. The question is whether this was an isolated incident or part of a larger pattern. The intelligence officer seated to Control's right leaned forward, his expression grim. Captain, we've identified similar tactical signatures at 3 other locations across Helmand and Kandahar provinces. Compounds that have been reinforced and prepared for defensive operations, with clear evidence of foreign training and equipment. We believe the enemy is preparing for a coordinated offensive against American forces. Control's eyes locked onto Kestrel's. We need someone to conduct reconnaissance overflights of these locations, someone with the tactical expertise to identify enemy capabilities and intentions without triggering a response. Your performance over Kandahar suggests you might be uniquely qualified for this type of mission. Kestrel studied the reconnaissance photos, her mind automatically analyzing sight lines and defensive positions. What she saw made her stomach tighten. The enemy wasn't just preparing for defensive operations. They were creating killing fields, areas where American forces would be channeled into pre-planned ambush sites and systematically destroyed. Sir, these positions aren't designed for defense, she said quietly. They're designed to draw us in. Someone is trying to create another Mogadishu, but on a much larger scale. Control nodded grimly. Exactly. Which is why we need accurate intelligence about enemy strength and capabilities before they can spring their trap. We're calling it Operation Silent Thunder, low-altitude reconnaissance missions using A-10 aircraft to conduct detailed surveillance of suspected enemy positions. The mission parameters were unlike anything Kestrel had encountered before. Instead of providing close air support to ground forces, she'd be flying solo reconnaissance missions deep into enemy territory, using the A-10's advanced sensor systems to gather intelligence while remaining undetected. It was dangerous work. If she was shot down over enemy territory, there would be no rescue mission, no cavalry riding to the rescue. Captain, Control said as the briefing concluded, you'll have 72 hours to prepare. Your first mission is scheduled for 400 hours Thursday morning. Target is a compound in the Arghandab Valley that's shown significant activity in the past 2 weeks. As Kestrel left the classified briefing room, she realized that her war had just shifted into an entirely different gear. The mission over Kandahar had been about saving American lives. Operation Silent Thunder was about preventing a disaster that could reshape the entire conflict in Afghanistan. But as she walked across the flight line toward her quarters, Kestrel couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Not by her fellow airmen. She'd grown used to that over the past 4 years. But by something else, something that felt predatory and patient. The enemy had shown their hand in Kandahar, but they'd also shown that they were studying American tactics, learning from each engagement, preparing for something much larger than anyone had anticipated. The next morning, Kestrel was back in the cockpit of Boneyard 27, but this time the A-10 carried a different payload. Instead of Maverick missiles and extra ammunition, the aircraft was equipped with advanced reconnaissance sensors, infrared cameras, and electronic warfare systems designed to detect and analyze enemy communications. The flight to the Arghandab Valley took her over some of the most contested terrain in Afghanistan, a patchwork of compounds, poppy fields, and irrigation ditches that had seen continuous fighting for nearly a decade. But as she approached the target area, flying at barely 300 feet to avoid detection by enemy radar systems, Kestrel began to see signs that this mission was different from anything she'd encountered before. The compound that appeared in her targeting display wasn't just another Taliban stronghold. It was a training facility, complete with mock-ups of American vehicles and detailed replicas of forward operating bases. Through her reconnaissance cameras, she could see groups of fighters practicing coordinated assault tactics, while instructors who were obviously not Taliban observed and corrected their movements. "Control, this is Boneyard 27. Kestrel's voice was steady despite what she was seeing. "I've got eyes on the target and you're going to want to see this. These aren't just Taliban fighters. This is a full-scale training operation for attacks on American positions." The response from Control came back immediately. "Copy, Boneyard. Continue reconnaissance and gather all available intelligence. Do not engage unless directly threatened." For the next hour, Kestrel circled the training facility at maximum sensor range, documenting everything she could see. Foreign advisors directing training exercises, modern communications equipment, weapons that hadn't appeared in previous intelligence reports. Most disturbing of all, detailed scale models of American forward operating bases, accurate down to the placement of guard towers and vehicle barriers. But it was what she saw in the final minutes of her reconnaissance pass that changed everything. In a compound adjacent to the training facility, partially concealed under camouflage netting, sat something that made her blood run cold. A Russian-made SA-24 surface-to-air missile system, complete with radar guidance and multiple launch tubes. The Taliban had just acquired the capability to shoot down American aircraft with guided missiles, and they were training specifically to target close air support missions. The trap wasn't just being set for ground forces, it was being set for pilots like her. "Control, this is Boneyard 27 with priority traffic." Kestrel's voice carried a new urgency as she turned the A-10 toward home. "The enemy has acquired advanced surface-to-air capabilities. I repeat, they have SAM systems in the target area." The response was immediate. "Copy, Boneyard. RTB immediately and prepare for full debrief." As the A-10 climbed toward cruising altitude, Kestrel realized that the war she'd been fighting for 4 years was about to change dramatically. The enemy was no longer just adapting to American tactics. They were preparing to counter them with sophisticated weapons and training that suggested support from major military powers. More than that, the reconnaissance she just completed had revealed the scope of enemy ambitions. This wasn't just about controlling territory in Afghanistan. This was about inflicting a strategic defeat on American forces that would resonate around the world. The kind of defeat that would force policy changes and strategic retreats. But as Bagram Airfield appeared on the horizon, Captain Kestrel Thorne was already formulating plans of her own. The enemy might have surface-to-air missiles and foreign advisors, but they were still thinking in terms of conventional warfare. They expected American forces to react predictably, to follow established tactical patterns. What they hadn't counted on was an A-10 pilot who'd spent 4 years learning to think like a predator, who understood that the best defense was often an overwhelming offense, delivered where the enemy least expected it. The Taliban wanted to set a trap for American forces, but Kestrel was about to show them that sometimes the hunter becomes the hunted. The intelligence debrief lasted 6 hours and involved personnel from agencies that Kestrel didn't even know existed. Every detail of her reconnaissance mission was analyzed, cross-referenced with other intelligence sources, and built into a picture that was both clearer and more disturbing than anyone had anticipated. "Captain," Control said as the debrief concluded, "you've confirmed our worst fears. The enemy is preparing for a coordinated offensive against American forces, supported by foreign advisors and advanced weapons systems. What you documented today suggests they're planning something that could change the entire strategic picture in Afghanistan. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A successful enemy offensive could force American withdrawal from key areas, undermine Allied support for the mission, and provide a propaganda victory that would resonate throughout the Islamic world. More immediately, it could result in casualties on a scale not seen since the early days of the conflict. Sir, Kestrel said quietly, "What are our options?" Control's expression was grim. Limited. We can't launch preemptive strikes based on reconnaissance alone. The political ramifications would be severe. We can't reinforce all of our forward positions without massive resource allocation that isn't available. And we can't evacuate from contest.